Hi, I'm Michelle Stirling from Friends of Science Society. I wrote a rebuttal to Martin Olszynski's University of Calgary ABLAWG post last week, and I made a mistake. So I thought I should correct it as soon as possible, and in person, or at least virtually so. First, a bit of background for people not following this story. A couple of years ago, the Alberta government launched an inquiry into foreign-funded anti-Alberta campaigns that have blocked pipelines and denigrated the reputation of Alberta worldwide. One big part of that is commonly known as the tar sands campaign. In January of this year, the Alberta Inquiry had released some preliminary reports and had asked a few participants of the inquiry, who'd been granted standing, for their comments. Martin Olszynski is an associate professor of law at the University of Calgary and a frequent blogger on the University of Calgary ABLAWG, Alberta Law Blog, one presumes. One of the reports by historian Dr. Tammy Nemeth outlines an astounding, larger, global plan to change society, trying to force everyone off the use of fossil fuels and using climate change as the umbrella rationale. Another report by Dr. Cooper at the University of Calgary discusses the strong resistance of ideologues to reason and the danger of that to society. And a third report by Energy in Depth does track the money trail to many environmental groups from big philanthropies or social engineers, many of whom were, coincidentally, named in the Nemeth report. Martin Olszynski says he has standing with the Alberta Inquiry and had publicly posted his response to these reports to the commissioner of the inquiry, rather than address the information that unelected, unaccountable foreign forces were planning to upturn society, particularly Alberta's oil sands. He was pretty upset at the reports that the inquiry had commissioned, claiming that they were promoting climate denialism. He claimed that Canadian courts have tested the issue of climate change, writing, "Fortunately for the commissioner, the facts regarding climate change have recently been tested in Canadian courts. Appellate courts in Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Alberta have all recently considered the evidence for anthropogenic climate change in the context of their own respective references into the constitutionality of the federal government's Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act." So, my mistake in my rebuttal to him, I accepted his statement at face value. He claimed that the facts regarding climate change have recently been tested in Canadian courts, and I believed him, but he's wrong. Olszynski used these references. The pressing importance of limiting such emissions is accepted by all of the participants in these proceedings. He added emphasis to that. The uncontested evidence before this court shows that climate change is causing or exacerbating. The dangers of climate change are undoubted, as are the risks flowing from failure to meet the essential challenge. Equally, it is undisputed that greenhouse gas emissions caused by people, GHG emissions, are a cause of climate change. None of these forces have passed judges by. So those are the references he used, but a legal expert pointed out to me that Olszynski is misleading the public with these, while he claimed it's both telling and relevant that no province opposed to the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act sought to deny the threat of anthropogenic climate change in their filed statements. The lawyer told me that this is not telling at all. He explained it to me this way. In law, there are certain procedures that take place when framing a case. The idea is to lay out at the beginning what you will or won't be arguing about. The lawyer said there's a legal distinction that all first-year law students are taught. A case only stands for the proposition of law that is a necessary part of its ratio decidendi. That's Latin for reasons for the decision. Everything else in the court's decision is called obiter dicta, or sometimes it's just shortened as obiter, meaning comments that may help explain or provide context for the decision, but they're not really part of the decision. So, contrary to Martin Olszynski's claim, that statements about climate change that he references from recent greenhouse gas pollution court documents are telling or relevant, well, that's not true. These comments are obiter dicta. This is what the legal teams both agreed at the outset to include, so as to clarify that the case is not about climate change. It's not about climate change science, but it's solely about the constitutionality of the federally imposed carbon tax. So it's true that the discussion about climate change was not contested by the province's lawyers. But that doesn't prove that they agreed with these federal government statements, which is what I wrongly assumed based on what Martin Olszynski wrote. So Martin Olszynski then went on to say, simply put, such arguments, meaning about climate change, if argued in court, would not fare well against the most basic evidentiary requirements. Well, that's his view. That is untrue. There is little evidence that current warming is outside the range of previous natural warming. There is lots of evidence that there are no trends to more extreme weather. And even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, published a report on extreme weather showing that neither carbon dioxide increases or human emissions have any discernible effect on the trends of extreme weather events. Likewise, the so-called climate sensitivity or warming effect of carbon dioxide has been dropping steadily in research assessments, meaning that more carbon dioxide won't have much warming effect. And some 400 peer-reviewed papers published in 2020 cast doubt on human-caused global warming and CO2 as the control knob that can change climate. So based on the repeated comments by many climate change law groups, it seems that they rely heavily on this 2012 paper by U.S. lawyer William Tucker, Deceitful Tongues, Is Climate Change Denial a Crime? In it, Tucker makes similar claims about extreme weather and wildfires as evidence of climate change when, as I pointed out before, that's not the case. His paper came out 1 year before the IPCC issued its AR5 report, in which it told the world that despite a huge rise in carbon dioxide from human industry, there had been no statistically significant warming since before the Kyoto Protocol was ratified, some 15 years prior. Kyoto was kind of a predecessor to the Paris Agreement. So I apologize that I fell for Martin Olszynski's claim that climate change facts had been tested in court. That is not true. And I ask you to consider the fact that the University of Calgary has a code of ethics which states that when representing the university, employees, academic staff members, appointees, students, and volunteer appointees are required to act ethically, honestly, and with integrity, and in accordance with the principles of fairness, good faith, and respect. I ask you to consider whether it is fair, honest, or ethical for an associate professor of law who must know the difference between obiter dicta, commentary, as the framing of a case, not as a decision of the court or ratio decidendi. Is it fair, honest, or ethical for him to suggest to the public that the courts have tested climate change when that's not the case? Obviously, most members of the public and journalists would take his words at face value, as I did. So, as Commissioner Allen of the Alberta Inquiry has repeatedly said, what the inquiry is about is following the money and the activities of groups that evinced harm against Alberta. And there's lots of evidence of that. We found a whole bunch of it online without much trouble. And why do we care? Well, because, as I just pointed out, climate science evidence does not support the climate catastrophe narrative. And as the 3 Alberta Inquiry reports show, activist groups have used the fear of a climate catastrophe to denigrate Alberta's reputation and drive off billions of dollars worth of investment. Some pundits have tried to pass off the Alberta Inquiry as if it's a witch hunt, suppression of freedom of speech, or some kind of grandstanding effort. But look at this. Here's the Alberta Oil Sands forecast from 2009. They forecast the growth of employment across Canada from 75,000 jobs in 2010 to 905,000 jobs in 2035. They forecast the generation of $2.1 trillion in economic stimulus over the next 25 years from 2010 to 2035. 2.1 trillion. They forecast the development contributing $105 billion to provincial taxes and over $311 billion to federal taxes. And they forecast the collection of over $350 billion in royalties from 2010 to 2035. That's from the Oil Sands Developers Group. Now imagine if we had that money now in this time of coronavirus crisis. So the tar sands campaign began as far back as 2000, and in 2002, when Friends of Science Society was formed, Dr. Sally Baliunas and Dr. Tim Patterson argued the scientific case against Kyoto, the forerunner to the Paris Agreement, with two people from the Pembina Institute. Pembina argued the IPCC's political position. And shortly after that, we started being smeared as climate change deniers, despite the fact that our people argued the science, not the politics. But that was an effective way to sideline dissenting, rational voices, wasn't it? And the idea of climate change denialism is something that Martin Olszynski continues to do to this day. Now, our 17th annual event speakers show that climate activists are undermining all your freedoms and that there's no climate emergency. So Canada's economy is being decimated by irrational ideology, and these environmental groups are trying to force this irrational ideology into law through the Climate Accountability Act, Bill C-12. Robert Lyman has a new report about it. Please read it and understand what that means for you and for our society. So the tar sands campaign picked up steam with a coordinated strategy by Corporate Ethics in 2008. And by 2014, Alberta's fortunes had peaked, and the tar sands campaigners celebrated victory after victory as Alberta and Canada suffered loss after loss. Canada is deeply in debt, broken by the pandemic and the 2 decades-long green trade war against the greatest economic generator in the country, Alberta's oil sands. Thousands of jobs have been lost, thousands of lives destroyed, all on false claims of a climate catastrophe funded by foreign interests, paying groups parading around as charities, claiming that they're saving the planet when they're not. So I don't see a net benefit. Do you? And isn't that worth the price of an inquiry? I think so. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Stirling.